All right, today we are starting with Robert E. Lee and his role in the Civil War for period six. I apologize. We're going to go through this one more time, but period four did not get a chance to do that. So we're just going to briefly recap Robert E. Lee and his entire his place in the Civil War. In the previous notes in last class, we talked about how Fort Sumter was really the beginning of the war, and when Robert E. Lee heard about Fort Sumter, folks, he had a tough decision to make about whether he was going to support the South and their movement towards a Confederacy, or whether he was going to stay loyal to the Union. After all, his grandfather Harry Lee fought for the Revolutionary cause, and there's a lot of loyalty and there's a lot of patriotism there, that fighting for a Confederate army that essentially is breaking off from that Union. That's not an easy decision to make. Now, he did marry, in addition, the great granddaughter of George Washington himself. Her name was Mary Custis, and they loved each other very much. And part of the reason he did marry her, though, was that he inherited a lot of the Washington wealth that came along with that. And one of these things was a vast estate called the Arlington House. It's a beautiful house on top of a hill that overlooked the Potomac River. And it was about 2 to 3 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And it's just a beautiful scenery and beautiful location. And when the Civil War broke out, Lee disapproved of secession. He did not like slavery. He did not believe that slavery was really a good thing, or that it was an economic means to an end. And so he wasn't adamant about the South and what they were doing, but he was really waiting to see what Virginia would do. And on April 4th, when Fort Sumter happened, it was only about 4 days later that Lincoln actually went to Robert E. Lee and said to him, hey, listen, Fort Sumter's fallen. I want you to be in command of the Union Army, all right, meaning the Northern Army, and I'll give you the keys, like I'll let you be in charge. You'll answer to nobody but me. And I want you to be in charge of the North. And Lee honestly considered it. It was a much easier proposition. There were more resources, more men, would have been easier to conduct war. But the following day, while he was considering it, Virginia decided to secede from the Union. And when Virginia left, Lee felt that his loyalty to his state was bigger and more important than his loyalty to the Union. It shows you a little bit about what people, even in the middle of the 1800s, felt about state versus national. We don't really talk about ourselves today as being Virginians or being, North Carolinians. We usually say Americans, but Lee said this in a letter to his friend. He said, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children. I should like, above all things, that our difficulties might be peaceably arranged, but whatever the result of the contest, may God direct all for our good, and shield and preserve you and yours." And off Lee goes to Virginia. Now, as for his house, which is located outside of D.C., the North decided to take his house as the battle started to go on and use it as a staging ground for Union tactics and troop movements and different things. And they were planning their strategies to attack Robert E. Lee in his own living room. And as the battles began to rage on, the North really began to grow these feelings of animosity towards Robert E. Lee. And one general remarked to another, and they said, you know what? Here's how we'll make Bobby Lee remember what he did. We're going to take the dead, and we're going to bury him in his front yard. And we're going to bury him in the backyard, and we're going to turn his property into a cemetery. And that property is now, in today's world, Arlington National Cemetery, and it's our national cemetery where heroes from different wars are buried, and presidents and secretaries of defenses, and it's a hallowed, sacred ground. But that was, at the time, Robert E. Lee's house. So, it's a very complicated war where people's properties and houses and homelands are being caught up in the middle of all this, and it's very difficult to differentiate between who, isn't who's doing right, who's doing wrong, and all these things. Excuse me. And so when the war began, now that we know that Robert E. Lee is going to choose his home side because of his loyalty to Virginia, it is important to differentiate and also understand that there are actually three groups that are fighting in the war. There is the North, the Union. There's the South, or what we call the Confederacy, and then there are border states. And the border states are a little tricky because the border states are slave states, But because of their proximity to the North, they actually remained loyal to the Union. So the border states in this case are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and then West Virginia when they leave Virginia. And they had slavery there, but they were not willing to jump onto the Confederate bandwagon. And so, why this matters is that the border states would have been invaluable to the South, folks. They would have, doubled their population. They would have given the Confederacy access to that Ohio River. Remember, they've been blockaded by the Northern Navy, and they would have doubled the industrial output. And industry is what wins war, folks. We talked about it in the Revolutionary War. We'll talk about it again in World War II, but you have to have industry in order to win war. You have to be able to supply your troops. You have to be able to give them weapons and bullets and have cannons and have mortars and have all these things. And without industry, it's going to be very hard. So when we look at the war and we understand that there were actually some states that could have swung the power of the war to the North or to the South, we want to also look at some of the advantages and understand why these battles happen where they do, depending on the advantages of each side. So we'll start with the South, and the chances for a Southern victory from the beginning were very, very long. It was obvious the South probably couldn't win the war outright, but that they could fight a defensive war, and really their strategy was try to outlast the North. And so, what were their actual advantages? Well, first off, fighting a defensive war does give the South a tactical advantage. And what that means is, by these two lines, is that when it comes to moving your troops on the interior, it's actually a much shorter distance. You can see that by this straight line, that going from here to here is much easier than having to go here, go all the way up and around, back over to the same spot. It sounds simple, or maybe it sounds silly, but the South was able to move much quicker and move their forces and their military around much easier than the North. Second, the Southerners were fighting for their homeland, and because of that, they had a great advantage in morale. It matters when you're fighting for your home and for your territory and for the places you grew up. It matters in the heat of battle, and when you're asked to push into a line of fire. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, he said this, and really read this quote down here, okay? He said, "Lincoln may bring his 75,000 troops against us, but we fight for our homes, our fathers, our mothers, our wives, our brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters. We can call out 1,000,000 people if need be, and when they are cut down, we can call out still another more." Pretty powerful there. So great advantage in morale. And then finally, the South also had a great advantage in military leadership. Okay, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are probably the most famous, but guys like Nathan Bedford Forrest and Jubal Early are going to prove to be very, very capable generals that are oftentimes going to outwit a lot of the Northern generals. Okay, so now we've covered the Southern advantages. Let's also look at the Northern ones. Number one, circle this on your notes. Okay, this is the most important. The North had over 80% of all the industry when the South decided to secede. Okay, so that meant they had all the factories and things that they needed to make rifles, ammunition, cannon, uniforms, shoes. I mean, you see this picture here. There are going to be times where the Southerners are literally going to walk through their boots and through their shoes, and it's going to be a sad sight. They're oftentimes talk about Confederate soldiers wearing mixed matched outfits because they don't have enough uniforms for all of them, or their uniforms get tattered and ripped and they just wear their own normal clothes. It's going to become a problem. It's going to be a serious issue for the South that they do not have the industry. Second, the industrial strength of the North also provided the Union with a lot of economic wealth. Okay, they are going to be able to continue their trading throughout the war, and so while the South grows weaker and weaker, the Union will essentially continue to grow stronger. And third, the Navy is all located in the North. So the superior Northern Navy is going to control the sea. They're going to blockade all the southern ports. And we talked about last class that the only hope that the South really has to win this war is to hope and pray that this Europe comes into this war and helps them by lifting this blockade. You couple that all together with the sheer fact the Union population was more than twice the size of the Confederacy, and you're going to start realizing that this is, from the onset, going to be an underdog fight, a fight from the South trying to preserve its life and its culture and willing to do anything to do that, and the Union really starting to understand how much brute strength it really has when it comes to preparing and winning a war. So let's get to the first battle, okay? The first battle, if you look at our date here up top, you do want to recognize that, is in July of 1861. A lot of these Civil War battles are going to happen in the spring and summer, when the days are longer, which allows for more fighting, and also you don't have to worry about the weather quite as much. And the first battle is in July. Now, when we talk about battles, it is oftentimes confusing because you're going to hear multiple terms for the same battle. For example, the first battle of the war, we call it First Bull Run, but you might also hear it called Manassas. Now, the reason for that is that the North, when they name battles, and here is Manassas on a picture of Virginia, we would be over here in Rockingham County. The North always named battles for physical features, geographical features. Okay, so if there was a river or a mountain or a stream of some sort, they would name it for that. In this case, through the battlefield or near the battlefield was the Bull Run Creek, and so they named the battle First Bull Run because that's where it located. Now, the South, they typically named battles for either the town or the railroad junction that it was closest to. In this case, there was a railroad stop at Manassas, and the Southerners named this battle Manassas. So if you're looking at the Civil War from a northern perspective, you would call the first battle Bull Run. If you're looking at it from a southern perspective, you'd probably call it Manassas. But let's get on to the actual battle. Well, news of the impending battle, the first battle of the Civil War, reached Washington, D.C., which wasn't too far away from Manassas. And a lot of people in Washington, D.C., not really understanding what was going on or just how bad war is when you see it up close, they decided to go out and watch the battle, almost like a movie. And they packed their picnic basket, and they packed their champagne, and they packed their snacks and their crackers and things. And they went out and they sat on the hillside and watched the North fight the South. So some of them sat to the side, some of them sat behind the Union soldiers, but they were going out there almost as if it was a movie. And they outnumbered the South by many, and they thought that they would be able to push the South back fairly easily. And they were successful at first, but at the center of the Confederate line, they could not break that line because it held firm under the command of Thomas Jackson. And it was here at this very first battle where the Southern men yelled out to each other and said, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." And forever his name would then be known as Stonewall Jackson. And, you know, Jackson, part of the reason he was able to do that was Jackson believed in divine destiny. He believed that God was going to have him die when his moment was to die. And so he found courage actually through religion to stand on top of his horse and urge his men on. He was truly not afraid of dying. And so with Jackson's help and with the reinforcements of fresh troops that came up through the rail at the Manassas Junction, the South was able to basically bring in 25,000 fresh troops and push the North back and push them so successfully that the North, that while they had more numbers, were completely unorganized, actually fled and they retreated. Now, the problem was when they turned around to retreat and they turned around to run up the road and get out of there, they ran into the civilians. And the civilians who had come to watch this battle and thought it would all be over very quickly are now caught in this mess of soldiers trying to retreat and carriages and cannons. And it was just a total mess for the North. And at the end of the battle, there was 5,000 dead on the northern side. And it was a disaster, folks. Lincoln looks terrible. The North looks silly. They were going to remove their commander, Irving McDowell. And here is a picture and a face and a name you want to get to know. And Lincoln is going to hire the second general of the war named George McClellan. And George McClellan is a very different animal. In fact, he and Lincoln are going to grow to despise one another. But Lincoln hires McClellan because if there's one thing that McClellan can do, it is train soldiers. And it was obvious from the Battle of First Bull Run that the soldiers were not well put together. They didn't know how to march. They didn't know how to fire. They didn't know how to move properly or fashion their weapons. And so McClellan was brought in, and as soon as he got there, he was shocked by the condition of the army. Look at what he said. He said, "Not a regiment was properly encamped. Not a single avenue was guarded. All was chaos in the streets, and the hotels and the bar rooms were filled with drunken officers and men absent from their regiments without leave. It was perfect pandemonium." And so McClellan looks at this and he says, all right, Lincoln, if you want me to be a commander, I'm going to put this entire war on hold and I'm going to drill and train these men for months. And during the fall of 1861, he basically puts the entire war on hold and trains and imposes discipline and order and really does put or makes the North a viable fighting force. The only problem with that is that Lincoln, that wasn't really what he wanted. He wanted this war to be over quickly. He wanted to show people in a presidential viewpoint that he could win this war before his next election. And he started to become a little frustrated with McClellan. A great example of that is in one battle, McClellan marched out onto a field and he looked out over the ridge that overlooked the battlefield, and he saw what he thought were cannons lining the ridge. And he thought it was going to be too risky to bring his force into that battle. When after the war, what we actually realized though was that the South had ingeniously taken tree trunks, painted them black, so when McClellan looked at them from far away through his telescope, they looked like cannon, and they actually were able to avoid a war that the North probably would have won. So he's very cautious. He's very hesitant. And George McClellan is the polar opposite of this guy. On the southern side, after the Battle of First Bull Run, Robert E. Lee decides to take his number one commander, Stonewall Jackson, and give him probably the most important job or task of the entire war, and that's going to be to defend the Union, or I'm sorry, to defend the Shenandoah Valley, our home right here. And over a series of numerous engagements in a series of months, Stonewall Jackson is basically going to defend the entire Shenandoah Valley from three separate Union armies. Okay, so here's Jackson. Here's how he would do it, folks. He would hit Fremont over here, and then he would retreat very quickly. Then he would march across the valley up over the mountains, and he would hit McDowell. And then he would retreat. Then he would go over here and hit Banks. Then he'd come back. Then he'd go hit McDowell again. And he never engaged in full-on battles. He used a very quick tactic called blitzkrieg that he I'm sorry, not called Blitzkrieg, but a very quick lightning type battle that the Germans are later going to use as part of their Blitzkrieg. And using these tactics, Jackson was able to defend the valley for much longer than anyone considered possible, because to the Confederacy, the valley was their breadbasket. It was where they got their agricultural provisions. It's where they got the food and everything they needed. And so Jackson defends the valley for a very long time, much longer than they thought. And at the very beginning of the war, the South is winning. And in the fall of 1861 and the spring of 1862, it looks like a very tall task for the North to win this war. It's going to take really a Herculean effort by the Northern soldiers and by the generals to eventually win this thing. So that's the end of Notes A. The rest of class, you are working on your assignments, and email me with any questions.